He's long gone. Why does the funeral matter now? Those were the words my daughter-in-law used when I called to ask what time my son's funeral would be. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone so tightly my fingers hurt, staring out the window above the sink at the maple tree Daniel had planted for me 15 years ago. The leaves moved gently in the morning breeze, and everything outside looked normal. Inside, nothing felt normal anymore. "Vanessa," I said quietly, forcing the words past the lump in my throat. "I'm his mother." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not a sad pause. Not the pause of someone grieving. It felt cold. Measured. "I have a lot to do," she replied. "The arrangements have already been handled." Then the call ended. I remained frozen in place, listening to the silence that followed. My son was gone. Even now, saying those words felt impossible. Daniel had been 42 years old. Too young. Far too young. 3 days earlier, I had received a brief text message from Vanessa informing me that he had passed away unexpectedly. No phone call. No explanation. No details. Just a message that shattered my world in a single sentence. Since then, every attempt I made to speak with her had been met with short answers and vague excuses. I told myself grief affected people differently. I told myself she was overwhelmed. But standing there in my quiet kitchen after that phone call, I felt something I could no longer ignore. Something wasn't right. I slowly sat down at the table. Daniel's favorite coffee mug still sat on the shelf nearby. He had given it to me on Mother's Day years ago. Every time he visited, he used that mug. I could almost hear his laugh echoing through the house. Daniel had always called before coming over. "Mom, put on a pot of coffee," he would say. "I'm 20 minutes away." 20 minutes away. The words made my chest ache. Now he was farther away than I could ever imagine. I looked down at my phone and opened the last voicemail he had left me. It was only 2 weeks old. His voice filled the room. Warm. Familiar. Alive. "Hey, Mom. Just checking in. I'll stop by Sunday if work doesn't run late. Love you." I listened to it 3 times. Then a fourth. I wanted to remember every word. Every pause. Every breath. By noon, I still hadn't learned when or where the funeral would take place. Friends had started calling to offer condolences. Several seemed surprised that I knew so little. One neighbor even asked whether I had helped choose the memorial photographs. Memorial photographs. I knew nothing about them. I knew nothing about the service. I knew nothing about any of the plans. Somehow, I had become a stranger in my own son's farewell. The realization settled over me like a winter storm. I wasn't simply being left out. I was being pushed out. Deliberately. I opened my laptop and searched for local funeral homes. Maybe Vanessa had forgotten to tell me. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. But deep inside, a small voice kept whispering the same unsettling thought. What if there wasn't? Then, just as I was about to close the computer, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name I had not seen in years. James Collins, my family's attorney. And before I even answered, I had the strange feeling that everything I thought I knew was about to change. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering the call. James Collins had handled legal matters for my late husband years ago, and after that he occasionally helped Daniel with contracts related to his business. He was not the kind of man who called without a reason. "Margaret," he said gently after I picked up. "I was hoping to reach you sooner." Something in his voice made me sit up straighter. "James, do you know what is happening?" I asked. "Because nobody is telling me anything." There was a brief silence. "That is exactly why I am calling," he replied. My stomach tightened. I walked into the living room and lowered myself into Daniel's favorite armchair. The fabric was worn along the arms from years of use. Every time he visited, he sat there with a cup of coffee and told me about work, about life, about things he never shared with anyone else. The chair felt strangely important now. "Margaret," James continued, "have you received any documents from Vanessa?" "No." "Any notices regarding Daniel's estate?" "No." Another pause followed. "That concerns me." I looked across the room at a framed photograph of Daniel taken on his 40th birthday. He was smiling beside a lake during a family vacation. Looking at that picture now felt like looking into another lifetime. "Why would that concern you?" I asked quietly. James cleared his throat. "Because Daniel specifically instructed that certain information be shared with you immediately if anything ever happened to him." My heart began to pound. What kind of information? I would rather discuss that in person. I closed my eyes. Nothing about this felt normal. Nothing about the last 3 days felt normal. James, please tell me something. His voice softened. I can tell you this. Several months ago, Daniel asked me to prepare a number of legal documents. He was not expecting anything bad to happen. He simply wanted his affairs organized. I listened carefully, and he was very clear about one thing. I gripped the phone tighter. What was that? He wanted to make sure you were protected. The words settled heavily over me. Protected? From what? From whom? I wanted to ask, but something stopped me. Deep down, I already feared I knew the answer. After we ended the call, I sat motionless for a long time. Outside, the afternoon sun had started to fade. The house grew quieter with each passing hour. I walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Leftovers sat untouched. I realized I had barely eaten since learning about Daniel. Grief did strange things to time. Days blurred together. Minutes felt like hours. I poured a glass of water and stood at the counter. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from an old neighbor named Linda. She and her husband had lived down the street from Daniel and Vanessa for years. Margaret, I was surprised not to see you today, the message read. My pulse quickened. I typed back immediately. See me where? 3 dots appeared. Then another message arrived. At the funeral home meeting this morning. I stared at the screen. The funeral home meeting. This morning. Hey. Meeting I had never been told about. Another message appeared. I assumed Vanessa had invited you. My hand trembled slightly. I sat down at the kitchen table and read the words again. Vanessa had not forgotten. She had not been overwhelmed. She had not been distracted by grief. She had held a meeting about my son's funeral and never told me it was happening. For the first time since Daniel died, a different feeling pushed through the sadness. It was not anger. Not yet. It was clarity. A cold, uncomfortable clarity. Someone was making decisions about my son while deliberately keeping me in the dark. I opened my laptop again and began searching funeral homes across the county. One by one. Slowly. Methodically. Then, nearly 40 minutes later, I found something. A small obituary had been posted online less than 24 hours earlier. There was Daniel's photograph. There was the date of the memorial service. There was a list of surviving family members. I read it twice before my breath caught. Vanessa's name was there. Several distant relatives were there. Friends were there. But my name was missing completely. According to the obituary, it was as though Daniel had never had a mother at all. I kept staring at the obituary long after the screen had gone dim. My reflection looked back at me from the glass, older than I remembered, exhausted in a way that sleep could never fix. I refreshed the page twice, hoping I had somehow missed my name. I had not. Every word remained exactly the same. Daniel's life had been summarized in a few short paragraphs, and somehow the woman who had carried him, raised him, and loved him for 42 years had been erased. I closed the laptop and sat quietly in the darkening kitchen. The clock above the stove ticked steadily. Each second seemed louder than the last. Eventually, I reached for my phone and called the funeral home listed in the obituary. A calm woman answered after the second ring. I introduced myself and explained that Daniel was my son. There was a brief pause. Papers shuffled in the background. Then her voice changed slightly. I am sorry, Mrs. Whitmore. We were under the impression that all immediate family members had already been contacted. My heart sank. Apparently not, I replied. She apologized several times and confirmed the location of the memorial service. It was scheduled for the following afternoon, less than 24 hours away. Had I not searched for the obituary myself, I might never have known. After ending the call, I walked slowly through the house. Every room seemed to hold a memory. In the hallway closet, I found an old baseball glove Daniel had left behind during college. In the garage, there was still a faded bicycle he insisted on keeping because he planned to restore it someday. In the guest room closet, I discovered a cardboard box filled with photographs. I carried it into the living room and sat on the floor. One picture showed Daniel at 8 years old holding a fishing rod nearly as tall as he was. Another captured him in his high school graduation gown. There were birthday parties, family vacations, Christmas mornings, ordinary afternoons that had once felt endless. I realized something as I turned each photograph over in my hands. In every major moment of Daniel's life, I had been there. Yet now, at the final chapter, someone was trying to pretend I never existed. The next morning arrived gray and overcast. I barely slept. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang again. It was Linda. Margaret, I heard something yesterday that bothered me. she said carefully. I was not sure whether I should tell you. I sat up immediately. Tell me. Linda hesitated. At the meeting, Vanessa introduced several people to the funeral director. Someone asked whether Daniel had any surviving parents. My grip tightened around the phone. And what did she say? Another pause followed. She said there was no family nearby who needed to be involved. For several seconds, I could not speak. I simply stared at the rain beginning to collect against the living room window. No family nearby who needed to be involved. I thanked Linda and ended the call. Then I walked to the bookshelf and picked up a framed picture of Daniel from 2 years earlier. He was standing beside me at a county fair, holding a giant stuffed bear he had won at one of the games. We were both laughing. The joy in that picture was real. Nobody could rewrite it. Nobody could erase it. Just after noon, another call came through. This time it was James Collins. His tone was serious. Margaret, I have reviewed several documents Daniel left with my office. My pulse quickened. What did you find? I heard him take a slow breath. Enough to convince me that we need to meet as soon as possible. There are things your son wanted you to know. I looked once more at Daniel's smiling face in the photograph. Then I asked the question that had been haunting me for days. James, was Daniel expecting something like this to happen? The silence that followed was answer enough. I met James Collins later that afternoon at his office downtown. The sky remained gray, and a light rain tapped against the windshield as I drove. The entire trip felt unreal. Just a week earlier, I had been planning a quiet Sunday lunch and wondering whether Daniel would have time to visit. Now I was driving to a lawyer's office because my son was gone and nothing around his death seemed to make sense. James greeted me personally in the lobby. He looked older than I remembered, his hair grayer, his expression heavier. He led me into a private conference room and closed the door behind us. A thick folder rested on the table. I immediately noticed Daniel's name written across the tab. My stomach tightened. James sat down across from me and folded his hands. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked directly into my eyes. Margaret, what I am about to show you may be difficult to hear. I nodded. Difficult had become my normal. James opened the folder and removed several documents. About 8 months ago, Daniel scheduled a meeting with me. He said he wanted to update his estate plans and organize some personal matters. I listened carefully. Was he sick? I asked. James shook his head. No. In fact, he appeared healthy and optimistic. But he was concerned about certain relationships in his life. My pulse quickened. What kind of concerns? James slid a page across the table. It was signed and dated by Daniel. He asked that this letter be delivered to you if he was ever unable to do so himself. My hands trembled slightly as I touched the paper. The familiar shape of my son's handwriting stared back at me. For several seconds I could not bring myself to read it. Then I finally looked down. The first line stole the air from my lungs. Mom, if you are reading this, something has happened that prevented me from telling you the truth myself. I blinked hard and continued. The letter was not dramatic. It was not angry. It sounded exactly like Daniel. Calm, thoughtful, careful with every word. He wrote about how much he loved me. He thanked me for years of support. Then the tone shifted. He explained that over the previous 2 years, he had become increasingly worried about tension within the family. He never accused anyone directly. Instead, he described situations that had troubled him, conversations that disappeared, messages that were never delivered, invitations that somehow never reached me, plans that changed without explanation. As I read, memories began surfacing one after another. The birthday dinner I was told had been canceled. The holiday gathering I learned about afterward through photographs. The family barbecue that apparently happened while I was out of town, despite nobody mentioning it beforehand. At the time I had accepted every explanation. Reading Daniel's words now felt like watching puzzle pieces slide into place. James remained silent while I finished several pages. Finally, I looked up. He knew. My voice barely rose above a whisper. James nodded slowly. He suspected more than he could prove. I stared at the documents. Why did he never tell me? According to our conversations, he hoped things would improve. He believed people could work through misunderstandings. A sad smile touched my lips. That sounded exactly like Daniel. He had always been the peacemaker. Even as a child, he hated conflict. I lowered my eyes to the final page. There, near the bottom, was a sentence underlined in blue ink. I read it twice to make sure I understood. Then a third time. If anything ever happens to me, please make sure my mother receives every document stored in Attorney Collins's secure file. My heartbeat quickened. I looked back at James. Every document. He nodded again. Then he reached into the folder and removed a sealed envelope. Unlike the others, this one was marked with a single handwritten instruction. For MOM only. Suddenly, the room felt very small. Whatever answers Daniel had been trying to leave behind were inside that envelope. I stared at the envelope for what felt like an eternity. The handwriting was unmistakably Daniel's. Even after everything that had happened, seeing those familiar letters made my chest tighten. James slid the envelope toward me, but did not speak. He seemed to understand that this moment belonged to a mother and her son, even if one of them was no longer sitting in the room. My fingers trembled as I carefully opened the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small flash drive attached to a note card. I unfolded the letter first. The paper crackled softly in the quiet conference room. "Mom," it began, "if you are reading this, then I need you to trust me. There are things I could not fully explain while I was alive because I hoped they would never become important. I hoped I was wrong." I swallowed hard and continued reading. Daniel explained that over the previous year he had quietly documented conversations, financial records, and correspondence involving several family matters. Not because he wanted conflict, but because he increasingly felt that information was being hidden from him as well. According to the letter, he had discovered instances where messages between family members mysteriously disappeared, invitations were altered, and conversations were represented differently depending on who was listening. He never named Vanessa directly in the letter, but the implication was impossible to miss. Then I reached a paragraph that made my heart ache. "Mom, if distance has grown between us, please know it was never because I stopped loving you. There were times I should have spoken up sooner. I regret that more than I can say." Tears blurred the words. I removed my glasses and dabbed my eyes carefully. Across the table, James remained respectfully silent. For the first time since Daniel's death, I felt as though my son was actually speaking to me. Not through memories, not through old photographs, through his own words. I continued reading. The final page instructed me to review the contents of the flash drive before attending the memorial service. Daniel believed the information would answer questions that might otherwise remain unresolved. He also included a final request. "Please do not act out of anger. Act out of truth." I read that sentence 3 times. It sounded exactly like him. James connected the flash drive to a laptop sitting on the conference table. Several folders appeared on the screen. Most contained documents and emails. One folder stood out immediately. It was labeled simply MOM. My pulse quickened. James opened it. Inside were scanned letters, saved text conversations, and one audio file. The timestamp showed it had been created less than 3 weeks earlier. My hands grew cold. James clicked play. Daniel's voice filled the room. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. "Mom, if you are hearing this, then things unfolded the way I feared they might." His tone was calm, but serious. He explained that he wanted a complete record preserved because he worried that important facts could eventually be distorted. He spoke carefully, choosing every word. He described misunderstandings that had been allowed to grow instead of being resolved. He described feeling caught between people he loved. Then he said something that stopped me completely. "If anyone tells you that you were not important to me, they are lying." I closed my eyes. The room seemed to disappear around me. Months of confusion suddenly felt different. The doubt, the exclusion, the growing silence. Daniel had seen it. He had noticed far more than I ever realized. When the recording ended, neither James nor I spoke for several seconds. Finally, he closed the laptop. "There is more," he said quietly. "Much more." I looked at the stack of files waiting on the table. For the first time since this nightmare began, I no longer felt completely powerless. Sadness still filled every corner of my heart. But beneath it, something new had appeared. Answers. And I had the feeling those answers were only beginning to surface. We remained in the conference room for nearly 2 more hours. File after file appeared on the screen. At first, nothing seemed dramatic. There were emails about family gatherings, holiday plans, birthday dinners, and ordinary conversations. But when viewed together, a pattern emerged. One message showed Daniel asking whether I had received an invitation to a Thanksgiving dinner. Another showed him being told that I was unavailable that weekend. I frowned. I remembered that weekend clearly. I had spent it alone at home waiting for a call that never came. Another exchange revealed plans for a family barbecue. Daniel had been told I declined the invitation because I was not feeling well. I stared at the date. On that day, I had been gardening in my backyard and wondering why nobody had invited me. The deeper we looked, the more examples we found. Small things, seemingly harmless things. Yet together they formed something much larger. For years, information had been moving through a filter before reaching either Daniel or me. Invitations disappeared. Messages changed. Explanations shifted depending on who was listening. I felt a strange combination of sadness and relief. Sadness because so much time had been lost. Relief because the distance between my son and me suddenly made sense. It had not been indifference. It had not been a lack of love. James opened another folder containing financial records. I expected something complicated. Instead, the documents revealed something surprisingly simple. Several charitable donations Daniel had made in my name had never been mentioned to me. Gifts he intended for family members had been described differently to others. Even small acts of generosity had somehow been turned into sources of confusion and resentment. Daniel had left notes attached to many of the files. His comments were brief but revealing. Conversation reported differently. Need to verify. Mom never mentioned this. Something does not add up. Reading those notes felt like watching my son slowly realize the truth while desperately hoping he was mistaken. Then we reached a folder dated only 6 weeks before his passing. James hesitated before opening it. This is where his concerns became more serious, he said quietly. Inside were several written summaries of private conversations Daniel had documented for legal purposes. He described feeling increasingly isolated from people he cared about. He worried that misunderstandings were no longer accidental. Most painful of all was a paragraph discussing me. My mother thinks I have chosen distance. The truth is far more complicated. I am trying to repair things without creating a larger conflict. Tears filled my eyes again. For so long I had wondered whether I had somehow failed him, whether I had become a burden, whether age had made me less important in his life. Now I knew he had been fighting to preserve our relationship the entire time. As the afternoon faded into evening, James closed the final folder. The office windows reflected the city lights outside. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, he reached into the folder and removed a single sheet of paper. There is one last thing you should see before tomorrow, he said. I accepted the document carefully. At the top was Daniel's signature. Below it was a formal instruction addressed to the executor of his estate. My eyes moved slowly across the page until they reached one particular sentence. The words made my heartbeat quicken. Daniel had requested that a personal video message be played during the family gathering scheduled after the memorial service. Not before, not privately, publicly, in front of everyone. I looked up at James. Has anyone else seen this? He shook his head. No. And based on Daniel's instructions, nobody will until the appropriate time. I lowered my eyes back to the document. For the first time since this ordeal began, I sensed that my son had anticipated far more than anyone realized. And whatever he chose to say in that final message was important enough that he wanted every person in that room to hear it together. The memorial service took place the following afternoon. Rain clouds still hung low over the city, turning the stained glass windows of the chapel into muted patches of color. I arrived early and sat quietly in the back row. No one had reserved a seat for me. No one greeted me. When I entered, a few people looked surprised to see me there at all. I simply folded my hands in my lap and waited. Daniel's photograph stood beside a display of flowers near the front of the room. His smile was warm and familiar. Looking at it hurt more than I could describe. Guests gradually filled the chapel. Co-workers, neighbors, extended relatives, people whose lives Daniel had touched in one way or another. Several approached to offer condolences. More than once I heard the same question. We were worried when we did not see you earlier. Each comment reinforced what I already knew. My absence had been noticed. Vanessa arrived shortly before the service began. She moved through the room accepting hugs and sympathy with calm efficiency. Her expression was composed, controlled. She never once looked in my direction. I found that strangely revealing. If I truly meant nothing, there would be no reason to avoid eye contact. The service itself was beautiful. Friends shared stories. Former colleagues spoke about Daniel's generosity and integrity. One elderly neighbor recalled how he used to shovel driveways after snowstorms without being asked. Another described how Daniel quietly paid for repairs after a local family experienced financial hardship. Listening to them, I felt both proud and heartbroken. They were describing the same man I had raised. The same man whose voice I had heard on that recording. The same man who had spent months trying to protect relationships while carrying burdens few people understood. When the formal service ended, guests were invited to attend a gathering at a nearby reception hall. According to James, this was where Daniel's final instructions would be carried out. The hall buzzed with low conversation as people settled into their seats. Coffee was served. Plates of food appeared on tables. On the surface, it resembled countless family gatherings I had attended over the years. Yet beneath the polite conversations, tension seemed to hum quietly in the air. James arrived carrying a small case. He greeted several relatives before making his way toward the front of the room. I noticed Vanessa watching him closely. Her expression remained calm, but something about her posture seemed different. More rigid, more alert. After everyone had settled, James tapped a glass gently to gain attention. Conversations faded. Chairs shifted. Dozens of faces turned toward him. Before we conclude today's gathering, he announced, Daniel left specific instructions regarding a personal message he wished to share. A murmur moved through the room. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. James continued. He requested that this message be played in the presence of family and friends following today's service. The room became completely silent. My heart began beating faster. Across the hall, several relatives exchanged curious glances. Nobody seemed to know what was coming. James connected a laptop to a large screen mounted on the wall. The image flickered briefly. Then it stabilized. A paused video appeared. The timestamp indicated it had been recorded several weeks earlier. I recognized the background immediately. Daniel's home office. The same room where he used to take business calls and spend late evenings working on projects. My throat tightened. Around me, the room remained perfectly still. James looked once across the audience, then pressed play. The screen brightened. Daniel appeared in frame. He adjusted the camera slightly and offered a small, familiar smile. Then he looked directly into the lens. If you are watching this, he began, there are some things I need everyone to hear. The room remained silent as Daniel's image filled the screen. For a moment, it felt as though he had stepped back into our lives. His voice was steady, familiar, real. Several people leaned forward in their chairs. Others wiped their eyes. Even after everything that had happened, seeing him speak again was almost impossible to process. First, he said, I want to thank everyone who cared about me. If you are here today, it means you were part of my life in some way, and I am grateful for that. He paused briefly before continuing. But there are also things I need to clarify. I noticed people exchanging glances. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Daniel looked directly into the camera. Over the past few years, I became aware of a growing number of misunderstandings within my family. At first, I believed they were accidents. Miscommunications happen. People make mistakes. But eventually, I realized something else was happening. The room grew even quieter. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Daniel explained how he began documenting conversations after discovering that information often changed depending on who repeated it. Invitations vanished. Messages arrived incomplete. Family members were told conflicting stories. He never raised his voice. He never sounded angry. In many ways, that made his words even more powerful. He was simply presenting facts. I spent a long time trying to solve these problems privately, he continued. I hoped honesty and patience would be enough. Unfortunately, some situations only became worse. I saw several relatives lowering their eyes. Others appeared visibly uncomfortable. Then Daniel said the words that changed everything. My mother was one of the people most affected by this. My breath caught. Across the room, heads slowly turned toward me. Daniel continued speaking. If anyone has ever believed that I chose to distance myself from my mother, that is not true. If anyone was told she declined invitations, ignored family events, or withdrew from my life, that is not true either. The hall felt frozen. I could hear the faint hum of the projector. Nothing else. My mother has always loved me. She has always supported me. And she deserved far better than the confusion and isolation she experienced. Tears filled my eyes. Not because of what he said, because he had known. He had seen everything. Daniel then described the records he left behind. The emails, the saved messages, the notes, the documents James had shown me. I created those records because truth matters. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted conflict. But because people deserve honesty. His expression softened. Especially the people we love. Several guests quietly wiped away tears. Others stared at the screen in stunned silence. Then Daniel reached the final part of his message. If you are watching this, the records have already been reviewed by my attorney. The facts will speak for themselves. I do not need anyone to argue. I do not need anyone to take sides. I simply want the truth to exist where confusion once existed. He paused again. The next words seemed directed toward me alone. Mom, if you are there, please know this. You were never forgotten. You were never abandoned. And you were never the problem. My vision blurred completely. Around me, people sat motionless. The years of doubt I had carried suddenly felt lighter. Not gone, but lighter. Daniel smiled softly into the camera. The same smile I remembered from countless family photographs. Take care of each other, he said. Life is shorter than any of us expect. The screen faded to black. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then I heard a chair shift somewhere across the room. Another followed. Slowly, reality returned. But something fundamental had changed. The truth was no longer hidden. It was sitting openly in the middle of the room for everyone to see. For a long moment after the screen went dark, nobody said a word. The silence felt different from the silence that had followed Daniel's death. This silence carried understanding. One by one, people began looking around the room, not at each other, but at the evidence they had just witnessed. No accusations were necessary. No dramatic confrontation followed. Daniel had accomplished something far more powerful. He had allowed the truth to speak for itself. I sat quietly in my chair, holding a tissue in one hand and the photograph from the memorial service in the other. Across the room, several relatives slowly approached me. Some apologized for assumptions they had made over the years. Others admitted they had believed stories that now seemed impossible to defend. I listened politely. I appreciated their kindness. But I found that I was no longer interested in assigning blame. Losing Daniel had changed my perspective. There was simply not enough time in life to carry every grievance forever. James eventually stood and addressed the room. He explained that Daniel's documented records would remain with the estate files and that his final wishes would be honored exactly as written. Nobody argued. Nobody objected. The atmosphere had shifted too completely for that. As guests gradually departed, many stopped to embrace me. Some shared memories of Daniel I had never heard before. A former coworker described how Daniel once spent an entire weekend helping him through a difficult period. A neighbor recalled Daniel fixing a broken fence without accepting payment. Story after story painted the same picture. My son had lived with generosity, patience, and integrity. Hearing those stories hurt, but it also healed something inside me. They reminded me that his life could not be reduced to the confusion of his final days. Several weeks later, I visited the cemetery alone. The autumn air carried a gentle chill, and the trees surrounding the grounds had begun changing color. Gold and crimson leaves drifted across the grass as I walked slowly toward Daniel's resting place. I carried a small bouquet of white flowers and a folded copy of the letter he had left for me. I sat on a nearby bench and remained there for a long time. There were no speeches, no dramatic revelations, just a mother and her memories. I thought about the little boy who used to ride his bicycle down our driveway. I thought about the teenager who stayed up late studying for exams. I thought about the man who never stopped trying to do the right thing, even when doing so became difficult. Most of all, I thought about his final message. You were never forgotten. You were never abandoned. And you were never the problem. Those words had become a gift I would carry for the rest of my life. Eventually, I placed the flowers beside his marker and stood to leave. Before walking away, I looked back one final time. The sadness remained. I knew it always would. A mother never stops missing her child. But alongside that sadness now existed something stronger than regret. Peace. Daniel had left this world knowing the truth. He had protected it, preserved it, and in doing so, he had given me something I thought I had lost forever. My place in his story. As I walked toward the parking lot, a light breeze moved through the trees overhead. The sound reminded me of afternoons long ago when Daniel and I would sit on the porch talking about ordinary things. For the first time since receiving that terrible news, I smiled. Not because the pain was gone, but because love had proven stronger than confusion, stronger than distance, and stronger than the attempts of anyone who tried to rewrite the bond between a mother and her son. In this emotional family drama, A grieving mother discovers she has been pushed aside after the loss of her son and deliberately excluded from important decisions surrounding his farewell. As hidden documents, private messages, and long-buried truths begin to surface, the mother uncovers a painful pattern that changed her relationship with her son for years. Meanwhile, the daughter-in-law struggles to maintain control as unexpected evidence reveals what really happened behind closed doors. Filled with heartbreak, dignity, and redemption, this story explores love, loyalty, and the lasting bond between a mother and child. Fans of family stories will be drawn into a powerful journey of truth and healing. Family stories like this reveal how easily trust can be broken. Family stories often uncover hidden motives. Family stories remind us that honesty matters. And family stories show that genuine love can survive even the deepest misunderstandings and ultimately restore peace. Character 1. A 71-year-old white American woman. Front-facing portrait. Silver hair. Gentle blue eyes. Modest navy cardigan and elegant blouse. Natural aging features. Realistic skin texture. Dignified expression. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Photorealistic. Character 2. A 39-year-old white American woman. Front-facing portrait. Polished appearance. Sharp features. Blonde hair neatly styled. Controlled expression. Elegant modern business casual outfit. Realistic skin texture. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Photorealistic. 1. Cinematic family drama scene inside an elegant American funeral home reception hall on a rainy afternoon. A 71-year-old white mother with silver hair wearing a dark navy cardigan and tasteful blouse stands face-to-face with a 39-year-old white daughter-in-law wearing an elegant business casual outfit. The mother holds a funeral program and obituary papers in her hands while maintaining a calm, dignified expression filled with heartbreak and determination. The daughter-in-law displays a controlled, defensive expression and tense body language. Large memorial portrait of a deceased son visible in the background. Guests and relatives watch from a distance with concerned, emotional faces. Warm interior lighting mixed with gray daylight from tall windows. Strong emotional tension without physical conflict. Cinematic realism. Photorealistic facial details. High emotional storytelling. Wide-angle movie scene. Natural skin texture. Detailed clothing fabric. Emotional eye contact. American setting. Dramatic atmosphere. Prestige television quality. Real-life family conflict. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Ultra-realistic cinematic photography. 122. Intense cinematic revelation scene inside a crowded memorial reception hall. A large video screen glows at the front of the room while a final recorded message is being played. A 71-year-old white mother sits at the center, surrounded by relatives. Her eyes are emotional but composed as she watches the screen. A 39-year-old white daughter-in-law stands nearby, appearing shocked and unsettled as attention from the entire room shifts around her. Family attorney near the presentation equipment. Dozens of guests frozen in silence with expressions of surprise, sadness, and realization. Bright screen light illuminates every face, creating dramatic contrast and cinematic depth. Elegant American banquet hall. Detailed furniture. Reflections from the screen across polished surfaces. Emotional turning point. Truth emerging in front of witnesses. Powerful family drama. Photorealistic human expressions. Natural aging details. Realistic clothing and posture. Award-winning film style. High realism. No physical aggression. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Ultra-detailed cinematic photography. Emotional masterpiece scene. 1, 2, 3. Emotional closing scene in a peaceful American cemetery during late autumn. A 71-year-old white mother stands quietly beside her son's grave, holding a bouquet of white flowers. Her silver hair moves gently in the breeze, and her expression reflects peace, acceptance, and enduring love. A 39-year-old white daughter-in-law appears farther away along a stone pathway, partially surrounded by golden and red autumn leaves. She is distant, reflective, and subdued, creating a visual sense of resolution rather than conflict. Long rows of trees with colorful foliage under soft afternoon light. Fallen leaves across the grass. Wide cinematic landscape composition. Deep emotional storytelling. Themes of forgiveness, family loss, and healing. Photorealistic environment. Natural skin texture. Authentic American cemetery setting. Elegant realistic wardrobe. High detail atmosphere. Quiet emotional ending. Prestige movie quality. No cartoon. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Ultra-realistic cinematic photography with powerful emotional depth and closure. 1, 2.